Well, it's 4 o'clock here in Moscow, and we can start. My name is Ivan Gruzdev. I work as a director of Center for Sociology of Higher Education here at HSE Moscow. And today we are very happy to have Wendy Fishman and Howard Gardner with us, both from Howard Graduate School of Education, United States. Pretty far, though. Thanks to Zoom, we can have you almost here. And Wendy and Howard, they're going to present a new book, The Real World of College, What Higher Education Is and What It Can Be. And in fact, it is an opening of the book in Russia, am I right? Yeah. And the book is interesting and important in so many ways. So methodologically, it's based on very extensive fieldwork, and practically, because it covers so many aspects we discuss here in regarding Russian higher education institutions and regarding HSE precisely. For example, we have a big discussion here, for instance, with Sergei Filonovich about the motivation of students, how they see themselves, their educational pathway. And in this context, we are very happy that you are here and that you will let us know what you have discovered after your extensive research. And let me say a few words about how our work will be organized. So first of all, I should say that everyone who are with us in Zoom, you can choose the language. You have this menu in the bottom of your screen, and if you like Russian more, you can switch to Russian when we speak English, and if you like English more when we speak Russian, you can switch to English. From the opposite, that is very convenient. And let me introduce the experts or the discussants. It's Sergei Filonovich, professor and head of Department of Organizational Behavior and Human Research Management at Graduate School of Business here at HSE. And we almost have Hamish Coates with us, but at the last moment he knows that he would not be able to attend, but he sent us the video, and we will show the video with Hamish where he reacts on the book. And we have 45 minutes for the speech, for the keynote speech of Wendy and Howard. Then we have like 10 minutes to ask questions to clarify. And Howard and Wendy, you can answer those questions. And then we have the experts and general discussion. So we estimate that we will finish at in an hour and a half. But if we need more time, I think we can, a bit stay here for a little bit longer. So that's basically everything I had to say. And Wendy and Howard, the floor is yours. You got like 45 minutes. Thank you.
Greetings. This is Howard, and I'm going to begin our presentation, but Wendy will do most of it. We're very pleased to have the chance to speak with you. We are social science researchers at Harvard Graduate School of Education. We work at an organization called Project Zero. I've been there for 55 years, long time, and Wendy's been there for 25 years. We've worked together on many research issues, not mostly in higher education, more kindergarten through 12th grade, secondary school, and with adult professionals. But over and over again, we became concerned about the ideas and attitudes of young people in the United States. To make a long story very short, they want to be successful in their terms, and They don't care much about ethical or moral issues until they become successful. Then they will try to do the right thing. This is a mentality very familiar in the United States, but I suspect it's not the only country where young people are very transactional and success-oriented. So we decided to do an unprecedentedly large study of higher education in the US. And some of you will be familiar with the American context, but I'm going to give you some background in case you're not. Achieving a higher degree in the United States has long been valued. It used to be a small minority, fewer than 10% had a higher degree. But after World War II, that expanded, and now more than half of American young people receive an education beyond secondary school, which we call high school, beyond the age of 18. So that's millions of young people. Our secondary schools, our high schools, are not as demanding as those schools are in Europe. And for some students, accordingly, higher education in the United States is more equivalent to a good secondary school education. We don't do much tracking. In Europe, often age 10, 12, 14, many students go off into a vocational track. That's not common in the United States. If we go back over a century, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, German education was widely admired. And in many places, including the United States, we created higher education with a Germanic flavor, dating back to Humboldt. And just as Germany in the 19th century created great universities to train scholars and researchers, and also professional schools for law, medicine, we began in the United States over a century ago to install the Germanic model. And I suspect this was true in Tsarist Russia and also to some extent in Soviet Russia. So Germany was a very powerful model all around the world. However, in the United States and Britain, England, Scotland, there was another strand, another option. We call that the 3 or 4 year college. And British and American colleges like Oxford and Cambridge are not professionally oriented. You study a discipline or subject, you have a tutor, a teacher who works directly with you, you spend a lot of time with peers, and you're prepared to occupy a leadership position in Britain or in the United States. And in the United States, many people, in fact, most of the Americans who you know, will have gone to a 4-year college, as Wendy and I did, and only then will they have a professional education like becoming a scholar or lawyer or doctor or some other kind of profession. In the United States today, there are thousands of colleges and universities. College means 4 years, universities means 4 years, but also professional schools. Harvard has 10 professional schools, as does Stanford and Chicago and other major universities. There are anywhere between 4,000 to 7,000 institutions of higher education in the United States, 4,000 to 7,000. I'd love to know how many there are in Russia or in China, but there are a lot in the United States. Some of them are very small, some of them are very large. Large means close to 100,000 students. Some of them are very selective. It's hard to get into. Others will take anybody who can breathe and has normal temperature. They can be public or private. They can be for-profit. That's relatively new, but all over the world, there are more for-profit higher education institutions that are opening up. In the study that Wendy is going to describe, we studied 10 colleges-universities. They were very different from one another. That's why we selected them. But except for one, they all describe themselves as having programs in the liberal arts. Liberal arts is a term that is widely used in the United States, though as Wendy will tell you, most people cannot define it. But it basically means it's not law or medicine or journalism or engineering. It's studying science and social science and humanities and the arts. It's a balanced program, more like some elite secondary schools in Europe, though some of those already can have a more of a technical or more of a humanistic trend. But our colleges are more like very good secondary schools in other parts of the world in terms of their course offerings, the subjects that they teach. For most young people in America, and you know this if you've seen American movies, college is also a social experience. It's a fun experience. It may not be as bad as the American movie Animal House, but people go to college, they've left home, most of them live on campus or near the campus, not at home anymore. There are many clubs they can belong to, many sports, fraternities, dining hall. I would say that for many people, traditionally, college has been more fun than it has been work. Though as you will hear, now American college students feel under enormous pressures. And this may well be true beyond the United States shores. Because most people who write went to college, college is a very popular topic for journalists in America. And there are many books about college that come out. I would say one a day, there's a book about college. So obviously somebody is reading those books, but most of them are more personal testimonies or descriptions of one college. They don't have a lot of data behind their assertions. And so that's why we began our study literally 10 years ago, 2012. And that's why we've written a book which has not yet appeared in the United States, but will appear very soon, called, as Yvonne said, The Real World of College. So those are the end of my introduction. But before turning the podium, the microphone to Wendy, if there are any questions of clarification about the United States education system, we would be happy to try to answer them. They will need to be in English or translated. I'm not sure I know how to get the translation. I see an icon that's interpretation. Maybe that's how. But Ivan or Sergey, can you help us if there are any questions about higher education in the United States?
Of course, we'll do it. If someone asks a question in Russia, we will translate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would suggest Wendy to speak, and then maybe if we have questions regarding higher education system in the US, we will address them after the speech.
Okay, great. So I am going to attempt to share my screen.
Does it work well?
I think so.
Yeah, we see it. Great.
Okay, terrific. Success already. Well, thank you, Howard, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. We look forward to the presentation of these slides and our findings of our study, and also to the discussion after our presentation. So today we're eager to share some headlines with you from our 10-year national study of higher education in the United States. As Howard mentioned, our study grew out of research begun together more than 25 years ago when we began to speak to college students. And also, as Howard said, in 2012, we were well aware of the books coming out every day about college, but these books were not always based on a lot of data. So our goal was to collect in-depth, qualitative data where we could listen very carefully for what individuals said and what they didn't say. Indeed, what people did not say is as important as what people do talk about. So now, 10 years later, after 5 years of collecting data, nearly 3 years of analysis, and almost 2 years of writing, our forthcoming book, The Real World of College, is due out in about a month. We parse the book in 4 different ways. We talk about what we did in our research, what we found, what we think it means, and finally, our own personal views given our research and educational experiences. So my plan for the next 30 minutes or so is to take you through some of our major findings, and then we look forward to a rich discussion with you. First, some brief background on what I'm going to present some of the very basic, what we call nuts and bolts, what we did and how we did it. For 5 years, we conducted 1-hour interviews with over 2,000 participants representing all the major constituencies across 10 different campuses in the United States. We interviewed 1,000 students. Half of these were first-year students and half were graduating students. 500 faculty and administrators, 500 parents, as well as young alums, those individuals who had graduated within 5 years of college. Trustees, those are individuals on the board with fiduciary responsibilities, and job recruiters. Some of you, I don't know, may recognize some of the schools shown at the bottom of the slide. If not, please take me for our word that the institutions that were included in our study at the bottom of the slide represent different categories of selectivity. Some are small colleges. They have 1,600 students. Others are big universities, more than 20,000 students. Some are residential, and others are what we call commuter campus, meaning that students don't live on campus, but they travel to campus when they have class. At all of the schools except one, as Howard mentioned, individuals that we interviewed were associated with liberal arts and sciences program on each campus. We were most interested in how those that were not specifically vocationally focused thought about the college experience. One of our schools, the Olin College of Engineering, is what we call a comparison school. These interviews took a lot of time. We traveled to campuses, met with faculty and administrators and trustees in their offices, took notes, and we transcribed every interview. Once our data was collected, we began to analyze our data over 250,000 responses to 40 questions that we asked. That's 11 million words across 2,000 interviews. As careful researchers, we analyzed the data by categorizing and coding each interview so that nothing was left to interpretation from anyone on our big research team. We used something called Cohn's Kappa to ensure reliability among our team. And even once an interview was coded, a different coder reviewed every transcript and coding. We coded both targeted questions that we asked in our interview, which I'll review today. And we also coded for what we call holistic concepts. These are concepts that you had to read the entire interview in order to decide or gauge how a participant could be categorized. We also investigated the frequency of words and phrases through text analysis. Sorry. So here's an important finding to keep in mind throughout the rest of the presentation. Across schools in the United States in our study, we found that students are much more alike than they are different. I don't think we would have predicted this at the beginning of the study. We might have thought that students who go to a more selective school, for example, would talk very differently about their goals for college, or use different words to describe their goals than students at some of the less selective schools. Or maybe that students who go to a small residential college might be very different than students who attend a large school where they commute to campus and work at a job in addition to going to school. But that's actually not the case. And here is evidence in terms of the words that students used in our interviews. On the left-hand side of the slide is a bar graph, and you can see for each school, we have a different color strand represented for each word. These words on the bottom, which you probably can't read because they are very small, are some of the 100 most frequent words that students across our study use in the interviews. And you can see that each strand, which represents each school, each colored strand, are most often clumped together. So it's not the case in this bar graph that you see strands or schools by themselves. This shows that the words that students use across these 10 different schools are much more similar than they are different. Some of the words are words that you might expect that students use most frequently. Words like class or professor or book. But some of the words surprised us. Words like mom and help. And just a word about the word help. While we thought that students would be talking about the help they give others, they actually were describing the help they needed. And this in many ways signaled an important finding, which I will discuss a little bit later. Help was a big theme in our study. And this is really before 2018 and before the pandemic. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that we asked in our warm-up questions in every interview, we asked every participant to describe one adjective to describe other students at their school. And these are the 10 words represented by the most common word that students on every campus used. You'll see that diverse, the word diverse, is mentioned 5 times. so that at 5 schools, this was the most common word. Similarly, the word quirky, which in English denotes strange or varied, was also used. It's another way of saying diverse. So again, before the terminology of DEI in the United States, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity was on the tip of everybody's tongue. It was a big theme in about what students talked about. With this important finding in mind, I want to move to our 4 central questions we will address in this presentation. Why is it important to go to college? What can students get from a quality higher education? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of higher learning? And how can we improve the college experience for everyone? So first, why is it important to go to college? In our data, we discern 4 mental models for the college experience: how people think about college, its importance, and how they approach the experience. This is what we call a holistic theme. We didn't ask students about their mental models, but we discern these mental models from the way they described their goals for college. So the first is inertial. College is just the next step after high school. There's lack of clarity about what college is about or for. The second mental model is transactional. College is the way to earn degrees, build resumes, get into graduate school, network with others that will be helpful for a future job. The third is exploratory. That college is an opportunity to investigate lots of fields, disciplines, marinate in new ideas and new activities, and meet new people. And the fourth is transformational. The purpose of college is to reflect about and question one's own values and beliefs with the expectation and aspiration that you might change in fundamental ways. So again, we don't ask people about their mental models, but students and other participants describe the college experience, and then as coders, we categorize those mental models. So very briefly, an inertial student might say something like this: to be honest, I really don't have any goals. I just kind of live day by day. I saw high school as a place to earn grades and get into college. It's not necessarily about learning. Or a transactional student might talk about getting the diploma, stacking a resume, seeing college as a stepping stone, and I'm here to get a job. An exploratory might talk about college as a way to get a broad range of ideas, to learn new ideas, make random friends, and also at the end of this quote, you'll see, be alert to seeing controversies on campus and how other people respond to them. And a transformational student might describe his or her college experience as a time of discovery, discovering who you are, considering the kind of person you want to be, a time to take risks, realize other people's struggles and what they face. So these are the 4 mental models that we discerned across our study of 2,000 participants. And here are our findings across students. Interestingly, here you'll see that more than half of our students are what we call transactional. Less or fewer students are exploratory, and fewer students are even transformational. The good news here is we hardly find any students that are inertial. There are some, and we should be concerned about those, but there are too few to speak about. Interestingly, we find very few differences across students. Across gender, we find no difference. Across students with different majors, like the hard sciences versus humanities or social sciences, we find no difference. And we find no difference with respect to where students went to high school. Perhaps the most interesting difference is that sometimes we find that students at different schools explain different purposes for the transactional mental model. So, for example, sometimes students at the less selective schools tell us that they need to focus on the degree and the job in order to be able to transform, to become a different person, to change the course of their life and their family's life. So we call this transactional to be transformational. It's a blended mental model. This is very different than some of or most of the transactional students at the more selective schools, which see college as a way to get into the best law firm, the best medical school, or to get a finance job. In general, we do find that over the course of college, when we compare first-year students to graduating students, while the percentage of students with transactional mental models stays about the same, the percentage of students exhibiting the transformational mental model does increase. And this is a promising sign for higher education. Here's what we find when we compare the constituencies that we interviewed. As you may remember, 1,000 of our participants were students, but 1,000 were what we call adults. These were on-campus adults, meaning faculty and administrators, and off-campus adults, meaning parents, the alums that had graduated within the past 5 years, trustees, or policymakers. And you'll see here that the on-campus adults, the faculty and the administrators, are represented by the green bar, and the off-campus adults, the parents, young alums, and trustees, are represented by the yellow bar. The students are represented by the blue bar. Note here what we call the misalignment or disagreement of faculty and administrators to the students. So almost 80% of the faculty and administrators represented by the green bar are transformational or express a transformational mental model as compared to the students with that mental model, less than 20%. And also note the misalignment of the same groups for the transactional mental model, where students represented by the blue bar, more than 40% express a transactional mental model, and yet less than 20% of their faculty and administrators represent that same mental model. Here you will also see a finding represented in this bar chart that students seem to be more similar to the people who are off campus, their parents, the trustees, the alums, than they are to the faculty and administrators with whom they spend most of their time on a daily basis. So our second question today, what can students get from a quality higher education? And here I want to introduce an important concept that we call higher education capital. We have, for short, call it head cap. While it is difficult and maybe even nearly impossible to demonstrate all the effects of college, we believe that we can measure and show the intellectual development of the mind over the course of college. So we created this measure, Higher Education Capital, which is the ability to attend, analyze, reflect, and communicate on issues of importance. The letters, you'll see, AARC is a nickname and denote each of these verbs: attend, analyze, reflect, and communicate. So to make this vivid, think about somebody that you might sit next to at a presentation before it begins, or on a bus or on a train. And you might talk about a book or a movie or even a political debate with them. And if you talked, for example, about a movie for 45 minutes or an hour, you might think about how your seatmate discusses the movie, the historical context within which the movie takes place, how the characters portrayed certain emotions, how the setting portrayed or evoked certain feelings, the costumes, the lighting. They might ask you questions. You might talk about if that movie represented the book on which it was based, the time period. All these questions and aspects of discussion would help you to decide how this person can maintain and sustain a conversation. And this is exactly what we did when we talked with individuals about college. We were looking for not what their views were, but how they helped have a conversation and their ability to connect the dots and to reflect and to communicate and analyze the situation and analyze the questions that we asked. This is what we call higher education capital. We hope everybody, as a result of college, will have it or increase their higher education capital. So we used a very simple scale, 1 to 3, to determine each student's head cap after we interviewed them. 1 meant little to no head cap, 2 for some head cap, and 3 for a lot of head cap or demonstration of a lot of head cap. Importantly, we can't prove that people don't have any head cap, so our scoring starts at 1 and not at 0. We coded or scored head cap in 2 different ways. First, we de-identified, meaning we took out the name and the school and the year of students, and we coded every transcript blind, meaning, again, that we had no identifying information. We coded a single participant's response to 7 different questions in our interview. And this is important because, again, we had no preconceived notions of who the student was when we scored these 7 different responses. And then we also gave an overall score for the entire transcript. This approach of giving an overall score let us step back and look at the overall picture and not to base head cap of a student on 1 response to 1 question. So for example, we have a question in our interview in which we ask all participants to suggest a book that they would give to a graduating student. This was one of the 7 questions that we coded for head cap. We did not score the title of the book. We scored the rationale for the reason that they wanted to give the book. So for example, somebody might say that they want to give a book like Moby Dick, which is a very complicated book that many students might read in college. And that would be impressive title to give. Another student might give an example of a children's book with lots of illustrations, but we didn't code the title. We didn't code based on whether we thought it was impressive or not. We coded for the rationale of the book. So it could be the case that Moby Dick could get a score of 1 if a student had no reason for giving it and just gave the title. But if a student had a long but interesting and reasonable understanding of why a children's book was important to give, that would receive a score of 3. So when we look across all students, we find a typical bell curve for headcrab across students, where the highest percentage of students are in the middle, the score of 2, and few students exhibit a score of 1 or a score of 3. In many ways, this is not surprising. However, when we compare first-year students to graduating students, we find some good news for higher education. While the percentage of students at score 2 stays consistent across college, we find that more graduating students, represented by the orange bar, are scored as a 3, and fewer graduating students are scored as a 1. We still should be concerned, at least in the United States, about the percentage of students that still have low head cap, even as they are about to graduate. 10% of students is millions of students. Again, while we don't find any major differences by students' gender or students' major, we do find some differences among students at different schools. Some of the schools participating in our study show that students have a lot of head cap growth, while others stay consistent over the course of college, which is alarming to us and should be a concern for the entire sector of higher education. I'll address this at the end with some recommendations. And here, interestingly, is students' head cap compared to the young alums in our study, those who had graduated 5 to 10 years out. This slide shows each of the 10 different schools and the head cap of young alums at each of these schools, represented by the yellow bar. The red bar is for graduating students and the blue bar is for first-year students. You'll see that at only 2 of the schools, School 6 and School 7, the head cap increases a bit, at School 7 more. At every other school, the head cap stays the same or slightly even decreases. And so while the alums were a small group of individuals in our study, we find that on the whole, they score similarly to graduating students, which is good news and bad news. The good news is that head cap does not decrease after college, but the bad news here is that it doesn't seem to increase either. And this is more evidence of the importance for the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to increase head cap and develop the mind, something that a first job doesn't seem to do. It's also important to take a step back and consider the relationship of head cap and mental models, the 2 concepts that I've just presented. What are some of the predictions about how they might relate? In a sentence, we find a significant relationship between mental models and head cap. Here you can see that those students who have a transformational mental model represented, here we are. So let me just begin. We find a significant relationship between mental models and head cap. On this slide, you can see that those students who have a transformational mental model represented by the orange bar, are much more likely to score a 3 on headcap than a 1. And conversely, students who have a transactional mental model, represented by the blue bar on this slide, are much more likely to score a 1 on headcap than a 3. So put simply, it matters that students approach college with a transactional mental model. Our data suggests that they may not get as much out of college as those students with a transformational mental model, or even an exploratory mental model. Our third question today, what are the obstacles that stand in the way of higher learning? And I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly because they may be very US based. We'll be interested to see in the discussion your reaction. I'm going to quickly go through what the headlines say, what students actually say since we asked them, and then from our analysis, another major problem. So first, what the headlines say, and we'll be interested to see if this is the same as your headlines. For us, it didn't surprise us that the headlines focus on finance issues in terms of the cost of college, free speech issues, what students can say and what they can't say. This is what we mean by speech codes and language police. And also, there's a lot written about social media as harming students. And of course, most recently, COVID and student protests about gender relations. Interestingly, when we asked students about these problems, they didn't talk about these topics. Instead, students talked with us about mental health among students. Even if they didn't identify a problem for themselves, they talked about it as the biggest problem that campus faced. 20% of the students did say they had their own mental health issues, but almost every student and other constituencies talked about mental health issues across their campus. They also talked about issues of alienation, not feeling connected to the academic program, their peers, or the overall institution. We call this a lack of belonging. And they talked about social tensions. If you'll think back to the word diversity that so many students used. Students talked about these social tensions across students of representing different races and socioeconomic status. Students talk about silos and groups of students, that those who are alike tend to stay together. And it's hard to talk to people that are different. However, we identified another major problem in our data. And this is the problem that students seem to be uniquely focused on themselves. We call this the I, and not the collective community, the we. We see this in the words they use. The I words we find when we did text analysis are used 11 times more than we words. And here is a bar chart that you'll see. The I words are represented by blue and the we words are represented by red. And as you know, through this presentation, it's not only in the words they use, but also in the problems they identify about mental health and belonging, their own transactional goals of wanting to get jobs, that we see that they are preoccupied with themselves. We find it troubling that there is little to no concern for ethics, broadly construed. Because of our own interest in the topic of ethics, we did ask students to describe dilemmas they face as college students. But the question was met with a lot of confusion. They didn't know what the word ethics meant. They couldn't talk about difficult situations or difficult problems that they faced on campus unless we talked about them first. And they also, when we asked them to rank order 5 different problems on campus, always ranked academic dishonesty, one of the 5 problems, as the least important problem on campus. But nearly every student acknowledges that cheating is widespread and rampant. So this is a major disconnect, a concern for higher education and society. So how can we improve the experience, and what are some of our recommendations? And this we discuss at the end of the book. We find a tremendous amount of mission confusion. Most students and parents, and perhaps the young alums and trustees, seem unclear about the mission of their institution. Students think that the purpose of college is to get the degree, to move on to the job, whereas faculty and administrators view college as a transformational experience. But even the faculty and administrators lament or complain that their institutions give mixed messages, that the institution focuses on the career center over philosophy department, based on things like the physical location of those 2 departments, the kinds of buildings that are given to people who work in those areas, the emphases in the information sessions when you apply to college, what you are told about what's important about that college focuses on careers and internships, all the different kinds of activities and events that are promoted on campus. We saw it when we visited all the campuses over 5 years. So for example, on the slide, you'll see a word cloud. These are the key words in the mission statements of the 10 schools in our study. Institutions use these words to please those that come. These are big promises that a college experience will focus on developing leaders, citizens, will help create innovators, will focus on character, creativity, diversity, the arts. But how is it possible that a student could make sense of all of this? How does a student know what he or she should focus on when mission statements cover this many concepts and words? It might be okay for the whole sector of higher education to have a range of goals that are shown in this word cloud. But how is it possible that a single college or a single university can be all things to all people? So we believe that institutions need to embody its mission and take the promise of college seriously. And if a school says it's a liberal arts school, they need to deliver on that promise too. So here are some recommendations. First, institutions need to develop a model, a single mission about the importance of teaching and learning. Second, institutions need to clearly communicate this mission with attention to both the direct and indirect messaging. And this can be done in 2 ways. Onboarding, which means helping students understand how something works and helping them become oriented. And then also intertwining, which means integrating or twisting together the different strands of the mission. So we believe in a single mission of higher education to develop one's intellect. If something else is important, like leadership or citizenship or the arts, it needs to be carefully intertwined and integrated into that academic mission. And then institutions need to sculpt programs and initiatives that relate to that mission and reduce or drop those that don't relate to this mission. We often find something that we call projectitis, a disease of too many projects, too many initiatives, too many centers, too many administrators to run these centers. And we need institutions to focus on a single mission. And if there is something extra, to carefully intertwine it. So in other words, in my closing words, we need to focus on the why of higher education, not just the what and not just the how. At the end of the book, we give recommendations to hypothetical colleges based on the problems that we've described and we've encountered in our research. We believe that in order to carry out the promise of higher education, we need students who understand and are prepared for the mission, adults who support and focus on the mission, faculty and administrators that embody it, and parents and trustees that encourage it. And we also need institutions which reflect the mission in everything it has to offer, from its people to its buildings, so that from a student's first visit to the day of graduation, the mission is clear and consistent. So I'm going to take down the slides now. Was I successful in taking the slides? I think so, because now I can see all of
Yes,
you.
success.
Okay, great. And I turn it over to our discussants and questions. I think our questions first of clarification.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wendy. That was very insightful. And we have several questions in the chat. The first one is from Igor Rimarenko. He wrote it in Russian, so I will try to translate. The question is whether students can transfer from one mental model to another. And if yes, then what are the conditions of such a transfer?
Okay, well, we hope that students will transfer over the course of college. Of course, if a student were to start college with an inertial mental model or transactional mental model, we hope that the college experience will encourage them to broaden their views about why college is important and to grow into a student that wants to explore different fields, different activities, different people, different disciplines, and also ultimately to change and to think about their own beliefs and values and to be transformed through college. So we hope that that would be the progression through college and not the reverse. So it would be very disappointing if a student were to start out with a transformational mental model and become inertial. Although, interestingly, we do find that among graduating students, they tend to become more transactional the closer they get to graduating because they're very much focused on the job. And so it is possible that students would move from transformational or exploratory at the beginning to transactional, but we hope for the opposite.
Okay, thank you. We also have some questions that Howard has already addressed in the chat. I will skip them in order to save time. And another question that is still not answered goes from Vladimir Sagvostkin, and it goes like this. So it turns out that college in US corresponds somehow to high school in Germany, like German gymnasium. And if so, could you please elaborate a bit on what the notion of higher education is, if it's not the classical model of German university?
I'm sorry, do you mind repeating? I think I missed some of that question.
Well, I will try. The question is tricky. So Vladimir writes that it turns out that college corresponds somehow to high school in Germany. So it goes something like German gymnasium. And if so, could you please elaborate on the notion of higher education if it's not the classical German university?
Howard, you're on mute, I think.
we decided that I will take the questions where neither of us knows the answer. I think that there are two principal differences. One is that in the gymnasium or the liceo, generally students are living at home, and so they go to school for their courses and maybe for football, but it's not as holistic an experience as in the United States, where you pack your car up with your suitcases and you drive your children or you fly your children to the college, and you're lucky if they come home for the holidays. The other thing is that we come from a background in developmental psychology. And I think that some of the higher ed cap measures are ones that would be more difficult to show in students who are 15 or 16 years old than students who are 20 or 22. Of course, there's the occasional student, probably some of the people listening to this podcast, who had high head cap when they were teenagers. But there's a lot of developmental research which suggests that it's at the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, that children can think more, that young people can think more philosophically, they can understand semiotic questions, they're less in a purely performance mode, namely, this is what I studied in the test, and this is what my right answer is. Wendy, do you want to add anything?
I think you covered it.
Okay, thank you. And then we got another question from YouTube. It is, so the mission is to produce Homo universalis. Is it possible now?
Universal man? Is that what's meant?
So yeah, Mira from YouTube, she understood your message is that college should produce Homo universalis, which is literally the universal man. And I think we can divide these questions into two. Is Mira right? Did she understand you correctly? And the second question, do you think it is possible given all the circumstances?
Yeah, well, while Wendy is thinking of an answer, let me give you one idea. In the last 50, 70 years, people in countries which don't have the liberal arts education often admire American men and women who've been at Amherst College or the University of Chicago or University of California at Berkeley, because they seem to have a broader knowledge. I've traveled to many developing countries where almost everybody I meet was trained to be an engineer. And that was probably true of the Soviet Union, if it's not true of Russia today. So yes, we do think that college is an incredible opportunity for a young adult to expand his or her mind in a way that is difficult to do when you're twice as old or when you have a full-time job and a family. And as an old person, I'm very old, liberal arts capital or universalis is something you can draw on for the rest of your life. I can't play football anymore. I'm not going to go on a lot of airplanes, but I can go to art museums, listen to music, read literature. In fact, I did have one translation of one of Wendy's answers. She described 2 American books, and I was going to use 2 Russian books. Somebody could mention a book by Tolstoy or by Dostoevsky, but not have a good answer for why they're mentioning that book. And they would get a lower score than someone who loved Kornei Chukovsky's stories and poems for children if they had a good reason for giving that answer.
Yeah, Howard, that all those are good points, and thank you for the examples of the books too. I would just in comment to the question, I agree, Howard, with what you said, but we also hope that higher education will help broaden somebody's understanding of the larger world, and also maybe even create a sense of responsibility that you should be a contribute to society in a positive way. And so part of what we call higher education capital is analyzing problems, connecting issues, so that individuals, even though they're gaining higher education capital for themselves and developing their minds, that they will use their minds well to solve problems for the larger world, which we all know from the last 2 years. There's, this is very important that we all put our minds to problems like pandemics. So yes, I think it's important for the individual, but also for society as well.
Thank you. I also have a short question. So what wondered me mostly from your book is the astronomical number of interviews you have conducted. And could you please say how many interviewers did you have, and how many people did you have analyzing this data? Because we carry out some interviews too, but it seems that it's pretty hard to work with this big qualitative data.
Yes. Well, thank you for that question, because one of my slides at the very end that I didn't show is an appreciation to our research team, because we had a very good, hardworking research team. We probably had around 25 different people that worked with us at different points. At any one point over the 10 years, we had about 10 researchers at a single time that were helping us to carry out the interviews and also to analyze the data. The analysis of data actually takes almost twice the amount of time that it does to conduct a single interview. So whereas single interview was about an hour to an hour and a half, it took double the amount of time to read the interview and to do what we call coding. So to categorize the interview by those concepts, and then to have a second person review that coding. So it does take an enormous amount of time, but we think it's, that's why the study is unusual, because it is based on analyzing very carefully what people say and what they don't say. Howard, I don't know.
Yeah, let me add a few things. First of all, I did a lot of interviews. Wendy did even more, but we each read all 2,000 transcripts. The other thing, which is an American question, but there's also an American answer, is how was this project funded? Who paid for it? And you will find this difficult to believe. We have 18 different funders, 18 different foundations, some very famous, others not well known, and private individuals contributing it. The study probably cost altogether $3 or $4 million. We never did the math. Now, sometimes there's a single funder, like the Gates Foundation, which can fund a whole project like this. And I think we would have preferred that, except that one principle at Project Zero, where we work, is that we always report what we find, and we don't try to slant things to please a funder. And the good thing about having 18 funders is if somebody says, why didn't you find this? We say, well, we have 17 funders. We have to say, other funders, we have to say what we found. And we're respected, I think, because we don't try to slant our data to satisfy a funder. we still have to make lots of hard decisions. And we confer, we meet at least once a week. Wendy and I probably speak 3 times a day because there are many issues of privacy and of intellectual property. And we try very hard to navigate a difficult terrain carefully. And we didn't have any real explosion in the study, even though we were working on 10 different campuses and working with thousands of different people. But it was difficult to do, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a lot of patience.
Thank you very much, Howard, about this information, because I wanted to ask a question about the funding, but I was too shy for it. And I think now we should turn to the experts. Professor Filonovich, I give you a word.
Thank you. I would like to know if Wendy and Howard can hear the English translation, so I prefer to speak in Russian. Can you switch? Поскольку большинство участников семинара...
Since most of the participants of today's seminar are Russian speakers, I would prefer to speak Russian using our simultaneous interpretation. First of all, I'd like to thank our today's reporters for their tantamount work that they have conducted throughout this decade that they have introduced to us. I have read the book, and I firmly believe that the issue that they have raised does not only concern American colleges, but it also concerns higher education institutions throughout the world. This is a book about higher education today. I would also like to point out an important thing is it has just been mentioned already that the method based on the interview and not on the massive questionnaire survey that is often used in this kind of research is a great advantage of this research, because this method allowed to obtain very in-depth conclusions and not just the confirmations of some predetermined hypothesis. And here we see the results that are very interesting to us. Especially they're interesting for those who represent the higher education institutions communities, and they were surprised by the differences between the views of the faculty, on-campus adults, and students. This difference in the views and the mentality is enormous, it's striking, and the many issues that we face are rooted in this divergence, in this difference. The book also formulated interesting recommendations that we need to listen to carefully, and I believe that an advantage also is the instrumentality of these recommendations. Some specific remarks related to the report and the overall research. Of course, as we have understood, and we have also noted this in the questions, the American system of higher education has some large difference from Russian system of higher education. However, reading the book, I understood some things about our Russian system. We don't have the idea of liberal arts. The only department of liberal arts is in the St. Petersburg State University. I think the dean is Alexei Kudrin there. Mostly, we live in this German system. That is why we have a mixture of liberal arts from the very beginning in a very light form, and then we move very quickly to what the authors of the book call vocational education, that is very professionally oriented education. And this mixture, not a consistent development first of the thinking and then upgrading it with some vocational skills, it creates great problems to us because our students more and more become pragmatic, and in this way they are more likely to fall into the transactional model and not transformational model. And when we are trying to introduce some subjects that would broaden their way of reasoning, they don't want to do this in our higher school of business. There were some students who were studying business informatics, and we suggested that they would study organizational behavior, and there was kind of revolt against this. They thought they did not need this subject, this discipline. Well, we understand very clearly that organizational behavior is something that teaches us to behave in an adequate way in the society. That is why I believe that this should make us think and reflect. Especially in our university now, there is a discussion about conducting a research on educational behavior of students. And the advantage of this book is that for our research, we can use a lot of the methodology of this book and their findings that Robert and Wendy have obtained. And I would like to draw everyone's attention here, yes, that they've just complained that every day in America there is a new book about colleges, but the content of this book is not underpinned with data. I would like to mention something about our university. Every day, managerial decisions in our university are made that are not based on data. And these decisions do not solve the issues that we face, but aggravate these issues. That's why this kind of research would be very timely. From the point of view of enriching the theory of higher education, the concept of head cap is very interesting. And this model of 4 types of basic motivations of students is very interesting. Yes. And they come with these motivations, maybe change them throughout the course of their studies in the college. I think that this classifications is also very useful for us. And we don't need to invent something new. This is a very good classifications. And the last recommendation is also very important. Those final recommendations concerning this so-called onboarding of first-year students. This is a very important task that we don't attach much attention to. That's why many students, I think, have the same problems that the book mentioned. But I'd like to point out that at some point there was an idea of creating a kind of high school under the supervision of Higher School of Economics. Yes, and the students will be kind of prepared for adapting at the university. But this idea was not implemented. I think that we should introduce some kind of this adaptation techniques, yes, especially for first-year students. That's why the recommendations in the book sounded very relevant to us and very important. Now, at the end of my review, I'd like, yes, I've already discussed this with Ivan. I believe that this book should be translated into Russian. Higher School of Economics publishes a very nice series. It is called The Library of the Journal, Questions of Education. I think this would be a very nice book in this series. Again, many thanks to our reporters for their brilliant research and a very interesting presentation.
Howard, would you like to comment on what Sergey has just said?
Yeah, I have some comments, but let Wendy go first, and I'll fill in as warranted.
Well, thank you for those comments. It's gratifying for me, and I know probably for Howard too, to hear that the book is useful and important, and also that what we found resonates in other places of the world also. Howard and I are beginning to work on a volume for Deadless, which is a journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences about higher education around the world, because our study is really just focused on the United States. And so we're eager to learn more about higher education in the world. And today is a beginning for us to hear about how the findings, how you understand the findings and how they resonate with you. And just one thing before I turn it over to Howard that you said that I think is important is that, and I'm not sure what the translation is, but that managerial issues are often not based on data. And I think that our goal, that's exactly what our goal is to look carefully at what the data shows and to help institutions reframe themselves to really focus on what's important and not what they think is going to please other people, but really what we need to know what students, how they're perceiving college in order to create higher education that's valuable and important for them. So
you
Thank you.
understood my comment correctly, perfectly.
Thank you, yeah, Sergey, for that very sensitive and sensible set of reactions. Both you and commentators touched on this surprising finding that faculty and administrators who see the students every day are quite remote from students and their parents and alumni and trustees who are the owners of the school and job recruiters. So there's a huge difference between how we at the university, most of you are probably at a university, think about higher education and the way that the rest of the society does, at least in the United States. And we didn't study any military institutions, Army, Navy, Air Force academies, and we didn't deliberately study any religious institutions, though a few of the institutions we visited had a historical religious mission. But I think that if a college or university has a publicly known mission, which is presented from day one, and which the faculty believe in and embody in their interactions with students, that divide would lessen. And I can't say this publicly, but I could take the American elite colleges, small and large, and rank order them in the extent to which the students get the higher education mission of the schools. In fact, Wendy and I can both think of students at the most elite schools who've complained to us about how anti-intellectual their peers are. And at one of the schools that's very intellectual, the dean told me, at our school, the weekend begins on Saturday evening, meaning the students work from Monday through Saturday. And at schools where my kids went, the weekend often began on Tuesday or Wednesday. So the message from the institution of higher learning is very important. But here is the warning sign. And I'm not going to be highly political today, but two countries that you know, Singapore, which is a country, and Hong Kong, which used to be an independent settlement, have recently terminated their liberal arts programs. And I think that's also happened in Russia as well, because liberal arts is opposed to free thinking about whatever ideas and criticisms you have. And I won't talk about Russia, but China, it's completely obvious that over the last 10 years, everything you say is monitored, and you can get in real trouble if you don't say what George Orwell would call Big Brother once. So there are risks with liberal arts. And we were talking earlier before the program, there are reasons why people study mathematics, or maybe why Sakharov studied nuclear physics. So there are risks, but as Wendy said, in the world that we want our children and grandchildren to live in, if you can't discuss things freely, the chances you're going to make progress on climate change and on pandemics and so on is radically reduced.
Thank you, Howard. And we also have a comment of Hamish Coates from Tsinghua University. I should say sorry for those who don't speak English, because we won't have translation for Hamish's speech since it's a video and not a stream.
Hello, Professor Hamish Coates from the Institute of Education, Tsinghua University in Beijing, and due to the time zone differences, a little late for me today to join the seminar live, so I'm making some remarks based on my reading of the book, which you have the pleasure and privilege to discuss during today's seminar. Thanks for the opportunity to join the seminar, to colleagues at HSE, IOE, and also to colleagues at Harvard who are the authors of the book, The Real World of College, Wendy Fishman Howard Gardner. Thanks so much. Look, I'll keep my remarks brief. It is late in the seminar and I'm sure you're keen to get to some questions. I have had an opportunity to review the book in brief, and it's a very rich and expansive book, generous in its conceptual reach, generous also in the empirical work, and generous in the contributions that it makes, both to the practice of higher education, but more importantly, I think also the way that we think about higher education, and we can start to frame ways of doing higher education differently in the future. It is true, as the book posits, that much of what we have today, almost by definition, was framed in another era, for another sort of societal need and educational need. And indeed, there are many existential crises facing universities or colleges today. And unless we twist and turn, and I would suggest redesign ourselves, we're not going to be able to either face those challenges or create the opportunities, not just for higher education, but also for the communities that we seek to serve. But also, we're going to face some headwinds from some other competitors in the tech sector, in the business sector, and in the social sector at large. So it is absolutely imperative that we give serious consideration to some of the underpinning issues that shape today's higher education, and think about how we can, together, as experts interested in this field, look to do things differently. Not just talk, but actually do things differently. There are some recognised cracks at the core, and really there are many ways we can start to unpack what those cracks are. You know, I've studied cracks in finance, in policy, in the way we understand student success, in the way we understand how students come into higher education, and indeed what they do while they're with us in higher education, and who does those things with us, college presidents and teachers. Many different approaches to finding out about these different topics, and it's a very rich series of, I think, around 2,000 interviews and many millions of words that the current authors have given us to help us delve into their thinking on what college is in the US today, but also into the future. Now, of course, the book is framed within the US higher education system, but that's of broader relevance to people outside of the US system, given the scale of that system and its preeminence around the world, and the fact that it's a very critical system which is constantly redesigning and redoing itself, and often, of course, in many of the ways that are forecast in this book, and through the sort of critical and analytical discourse that this book proposes for all of us involved in higher education. I think we should assume that there is much more value in understanding and enhancing the life of college or universities than there is simply having a great building and producing static things which find their way into the world. That is, we need not just to focus on the business or the policy, the sort of dry stuff of university studies. We have to focus on the life of university colleges. Now, this is an area where this book really makes an important contribution, not just through talking with so many people, but touching on two really important issues, the ideas of, framed in the book as mental health, but we can think of it much more broadly as how people use universities and colleges to help themselves become different people and prosper in the world. Of course, at one end you might say there is an element of mental illness, but even up the other end where people are flourishing and highly successful, they can often feel very uncertain. And so how we can understand their way of interacting with the college or the university is really important. About 5-6 years ago, I led a project in my home country, Australia, where we looked at the pathways that help map out different sorts of student success. There was, of course, a prevailing policy or institutional view that student success is defined in certain small suite of statistics. Of course, the reality is a lot more complicated. And we started to say, well, how do we get that complex reality and start to link that with some of the ways that we do define student success in more formal political or institutional circumstances. This book goes to the next level and really shows us that unless we really touch base with and understand our students, unless we find out ways of helping those students succeed as individuals within disciplinary and social systems, then we haven't really done our job as higher education professionals. And of course, closely linked in with the mental health consideration is ideas around a sense of belonging, another topic touched on by the book. And I enjoyed reading the case studies and the individual stories around those, and it reminded me a great deal of a book that I drew on in my own PhD studies, as well by someone who was studying at Harvard at the time, Graham Little, a fantastic book called Faces on Campus. It is people that make up higher education, not just publications, bibliometric patents or products. And it's really important that even once we've gone through the process of massification and internationalization, and now increasingly digitization, that we keep in mind the absolute critical role that people play and the role of people in higher education. Now, great ideas are sort of wasted ideas unless we find a way of implementing them. And it's for that reason that I suppose in the last part of the book, the last section, the authors have taken the trouble to give us some guidance as to how to turn their thinking into some projections for administrators in college, but also for students and society more broadly. Because, of course, it's not just up to the formal leaders to do this stuff. It's up to all of us involved in higher education. And indeed, increasingly, as we see around the world, it's up to the whole university community to work together and co-create the new futures for particular universities, disciplines, or aspects of contribution and engagement with the broader community. Certainly, this is a project which involves more than digitisation. If you read the higher education press globally, or in many of the world's biggest higher education countries, and you didn't know anything about higher education before, you would reach the view pretty quickly that whacking everything, content, people, profiles, journeys on a computer platform was the ants' pants and bees' knees of higher education. In fact, you could quickly, through just an hour of reading the contemporary higher education press, reach the view that computers are going to solve all of the problems of higher education. This book reminds us otherwise, that in fact higher education, and education more generally of course, is very much about people. So it gives us some prescriptions for how to turn those ideas about people into some usable strategies. And the key one that really stuck out for me was moving beyond projectization. I think I've got that right. Seeing everything as a micro problem which can be resolved through what a former colleague of mine referred to as small working group. They're never small and they never work and they're hardly ever a group. In fact, it's a much more broad and more engaging process that's required, a much more inviting venture to treat people like humans, onboard them, entwine them in the mission of the college, and really pick them up and bring them with us. I suppose there's an element of nostalgia in that view. A lot easier to do that in a very small institution that's resource rich. The real challenge in all of this, of course, is scaling these good ideas out to the real world of higher education, which is not just the top 1, 2, 3 or 4 or 5%, but the many thousands of institutions that really did the heavy lifting for the system and higher education all around the world. How to take those ideas and make them real. Now, despite what I said about computers just a while ago, it's almost invariably going to be the case that computers are going to help us do this, as they have in so many other sectors. And in fact, we see now that many management service organisations in the online and computerised education world are really being successful in offering that feedback and dynamic support to managers and teachers and helping them to help students learn. I could say a lot more, but clearly I really feel that just the brief time I've spent with this book, and indeed I look forward to reading the book when it finally arrives in hard form in much more depth, the brief time I spent with this book has signposted for me that we need to involve not just the universities, not just computers and projects and sprints and all sorts of fantastic deliverables, but most importantly, consideration of the broader humans and students who we help to cultivate and help flourish into the people that are going to help us to transform society for the future. So thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity of reading the book, The Real World of College, and I look forward to hearing feedback from the seminar and look forward to talking with many of you later on. Thank you so much.
Well, that was Hamish Coates, especially for our meeting. Do you have something to comment?
I can start. Well, first of all, I hope you'll convey appreciation for his thoughts. I think he touched on something that's important to both of us, which is that in some ways, while people look to solve all kinds of problems with, complicated systems and more people and more buildings and more technology, I think what we're arguing for is to simplify and to reduce the number of structures and people and things, and to really focus on what we now have learned are the problems in higher education as a sector and with institutions, but also with the individuals themselves, belonging and mental health. And in the book, we do have a chapter on mental health, and we do have a chapter on our findings about belonging. And while we don't believe that institutions can take on these student problems themselves, they do need to help students deal with these problems as they're onboarding students and continue to nurture and assist students with those problems throughout. But it can't take over the academic mission of an institution. And so that's why we have the concept of onboarding. So I guess what I'm saying is, at the same time that we want to help students and institutions solve problems, we also are arguing that institutions should simplify and reduce all the different kinds of programs that exist that ultimately end up confusing students and maybe even causing more problems for them throughout their course of college. So, Howard, do you have any other comments to add?
Yes, I also thought that, we've just begun to speak about this book publicly. And so it's very interesting to hear how people who read it, like Sergey, what they take out of it. And the focus on the human dimension, the fact that we're dealing with real human beings who are entering the prime of their life, is something that's important to us, but we probably didn't state that as well as the speaker. I just wanted to mention one other thing, expanding on what Wendy mentioned earlier. With a scholar named William Kirby, we're preparing a publication on universities around the world. And Kirby, who is a professor of Chinese history at Harvard, has a book coming out with the Harvard University Press. I think it's called Empires of Ideas. Empires of Ideas. And it has a very interesting thesis that around 1900, Germany was the model for everybody. Around 2000, it became the United States. If you look at global rankings, which are the obsession of university leaders all around the world, most of the schools that are at the top are United States or British. The question is, will there be a model for the 21st century? And if so, where will it be? And even though the speaker is from Australia, we all notice she's from Tsinghua, which is as important a university as exists in China and is always among the top 20 or so around the world. And so for those of you who are younger, coming attractions, as we say in the movies, will be to see whether in the 21st century, there is a model of higher education which the rest of the world looks to with admiration, or whether it's more pluralistic. And maybe there'll be a European and a Latin American and a African and a Trump university and a non-Trump university. That's as political as I'll get today. Russia has been important in human history for centuries, and what gets worked out there over the next decades will be important for education, learning, and for what it means to be a human being as we live in an increasingly digital and global age. So that's what I have to say as a benediction.
Okay, thanks a lot. We're a bit out of time, but if we have someone with an urgent need to speak, among the audience, we will give this person a chance. Do we have anyone? 1, 2, 3. So no urgent need to speak. Many thanks again, Wendy and Howard. If you would like to say a few words, to finish our meeting, that would be great.
Sure. I think just appreciation for this opportunity to share the book with you and our project and our findings. And thank you for hosting this seminar for us. I know in the chat you put the link to our website, which we update often. We regularly contribute blogs there about different topics and issues that come, recent issues that we face and think about, and we'll be continuing to do that. And also on our website, we will have a sample of the higher education survey that we created. After doing all of the interviews, we have a survey that other institutions and potentially countries can use to look at the concepts that we studied. So we wanted to make sure to leave a legacy of our project for others to be able to investigate their institutions and their students as much as possible. So we hope you'll follow us on our website, and we're always available for questions over email. Our contact information is there. Howard, anything from you?
No, well said. Of course, I like the idea this might be translated into Russian. And if it is, we will be happy to write a foreword for that translation.
Well, thank you very much again. And I would like to thank Sergei Filonovich for your comments. And as you mentioned, everyone is very happy that this meeting has occurred. And we were extremely happy to have you here. So have a good day. I know it's morning in US. So thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.